Welcome to this panel, which is called Contours of the New Global Economy and Russia's Challenge to Respond. My name is Robin Lewis. I direct the Master of Global Public Policy program here at RANEPA, and I am your moderator or chair. Let me briefly introduce the panelists and give a few comments at the beginning, more about the format than about the substance. From my left is John Zysman. By the way, these names are Slavicized. He's not Zysman, he's Zysman, but never mind. John Zysman, who is professor at the University of California-Berkeley, founding director of the Berkeley Roundtable on International Economics. Next to him, Peter Gourevitch, who is professor and founding dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California at San Diego. And then our discussants, Yermolai Solzhenitsyn, senior partner or managing partner, I'm not sure which, maybe both, at McKinsey in Moscow. Mathilde Mesnard from OECD, where she's deputy director of the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs based in Paris. And finally, Mikhail Pryadilnikov, who is the deputy director of the Analytical Center of the Government of the Russian Federation, and we're very pleased to see them. Those of you, I suspect most of you, have spent not just this year, but other years in January at the Gaidar Forum, and you'll know that the standard Gaidar Forum format is a massive panel with many people speaking for 40 to 50 seconds. I exaggerate a bit. And I fought hard and finally won a battle to have a different format, which is what you will, I hope, enjoy the fruits of here this afternoon. And that is to have two longer presentations by our colleagues from California, and then some also longer commentaries from a more sensible and practical number of participants. So we will not move in the usual fashion, but rather we'll have two somewhat longer presentations, 25 minutes to a half hour, and then we'll ask the various commentators to offer their suggestions. I will say about the topic only that this is one that intersects with a lot of the other most pressing economic policy panels at the Gaidar Forum. And that we're especially lucky to have both a global perspective and a Russian perspective at the highest levels, talking about where the global economy is going, particularly in regard to the topics of our first two speakers, which are the digital economy and then corporate governance, which are issues that are really quite relevant to Russia and to Russia's future economic success. So without further ado, I will ask John Zysman to speak. Do we have the... you have the clicker, yes?
I don't have that.
Yeah, give him a minute. There we go.
The secret is the slides are not only for you, they're my speaking notes. So that, there we go. So without them, I'm completely lost and make a hopeless fool of myself. So it's a great pleasure to be with you, and I've enjoyed the last few days of the Gaidar Forum very much and tried, as Robin knows, to reshape my remarks after hearing those 2 days to try and more directly address some of the questions. But this really does remain a view from Silicon Valley, and I should say one or two things about the Berkeley Roundtable. We started in the middle of the U.S.-Japan trade wars back a number of years ago when some of the founding members of major companies there, Bob Noyce, who founded Intel, Jerry Sanders at Charlie Spork, who founded other semiconductor firms, David Packard, Steve Jobs, we ended up in a conversation about how the global economy worked, how national systems interacted in the global system, and obviously around technology. So we've been following these issues really from a very long time. What I've seen in the last couple of days here is that there really is a recognition that there's an emerging narrative about the character of the global economy, that there are 2 or 3 unfolding dramatic technologies that are likely to reshape the way choices and options in the economy and the rest of the economy work. Both, in fact, renewable energy and reframing the grid, which is, I think, one of the very important issues which we're not going to address here, and the issue of our focus this morning, my focus this morning, computing abundance. So I'm really going to tell you a tale, if you will, of the journey in electronics and digital computing from chips, microchips, semiconductors, which was an era of very limited computing power. We all thought it was spectacular that we had little ability to add and subtract on a single device, but it, in fact, is very primitive to the cloud computing, which is an enormous abundance, enormous resources of computing that overshadow anything that had previously been there. And the key features of the present era are, one, the rise of the platform economy, and two, computation-intensive automation. And what they lead to are choices for governments of how to situate in the digital economy and how to capture the gains of this system, of this transformation, and how to avoid the plane. Now, I'm going to jump ahead in order to keep everybody focused and to try and suggest what the basic conclusions actually are. And for anyone who wants, I'm perfectly happy to share these slides so that you'll have them. Computing abundance is really driving the new disruptive phase. It makes computing availability easier and less expensive dramatically. And it's expressed by platforms such as Amazon, industrial transformations such as Industry 4.0. In order to understand this current disruption, we're going to have to step back just slightly and look at the globalization and the reconfiguration of the global economy over the past few years. And if we look from Silicon Valley, the central issues in this era of computing abundance are, one, can the digital revolution really provide real and rising incomes with reasonable levels of equality? Can it provide productivity and growth? Can it create jobs? And what kind of society do we really want to create with this set of transformations? And we are going to look at the globalization and emergence of the transformation of the economy prior to the cloud, and then look at the era of the cloud. But before we do that, I want to take one moment and acknowledge that many people now think that the digital transformation is all over, and that therefore we're completely wasting our time talking about this. Some of you know Robert Gordon's book, The Decline of American Growth. So I want to say a couple of things just to set the stage for that. The core argument of those who say we've really lost our way in focusing on these technologies is that there's a dramatic drop in productivity and that, in fact, the dramatic changes in life are long past. That it's more important to have a refrigerator from 1870 to 1970 than it is to have a cell phone. That, in fact, the long expansion in life cycles really came with clean water and not with million-dollar pieces of medical equipment. That argument really is that the information technology wave has burst, that it was limited in scope in the first place. It only affected finance and entertainment, and it had limited, the power of the technology was therefore quite limited. The view you'll hear here is that we're just getting started, that this wave is just starting to sweep along. It's a story of services with everything, services transformed by information technology, whether it's Airbnb or Uber, the Internet of Things, the connected ways of manufacturing and producing, digital platforms, big data, computation, intensive automation, and the ongoing emergence of AI and robotics and the like. Where we are in the wave is a matter of speculation, but diffusion and deployment will be what's crucial. And I'll leave it to our commentator to remark on the OECD debate, which I deeply agree with, which is that the top 10, there's a story of the best and the rest. And really for countries, the question is going to be, are you going to be part of the best, or are you going to just be at the other end of the rest? Why does that matter? The leading companies are transforming the production frontiers. The leading 10% of firms in each of the sectors in recent OECD studies that I'm sure that you'll be discussing, in fact, are dramatically changing production, and the other 90% are way behind. And the question becomes why and what are the consequences? And therefore, whether it be for France, the United States, whether it be for Russia, the question is, what are the implications of that? Okay, so let's pick up our story and run through this in the few minutes that we really have to tell what is a very complex tale, actually. And the way of looking at it is first the story of globalization and the commodity trap, and the emergence of what I call services with everything. And then from that comes cloud computing. So the stage one in this story is globalization, which transformed work and lives. We should be very clear that whenever people say it didn't transform globalization very much, it may have had various consequences in the richest countries, but it also spread production, spread growth throughout the rest of the world. What we really saw was vertically integrated production, all of an auto sector being produced in one segment geographically of each country, or one segment of a production of a refrigerator produced in one segment of a country, to suddenly it's the production process is being decomposed, and not only broken into parts which were then produced by different companies, but that decomposition was then spread geographically around the world. In fact, that changed things very dramatically. The second part of that was that production process was then recomposed. We went from, in a sense, the auto sector that in Detroit or around Toyota into stages of production being geographically specific. So what is it that Silicon Valley really does? Does it produce anything? People say, no, it doesn't produce anything. Well, we generate the ideas. We generate not only particular products, but new companies in very dramatic kind of way. So if you look at an iPhone, you'll discover that, in fact, if you decompose the product, the huge portion of that value is in Silicon Valley in intellectual property rights, which are design, and the product and production is in Shenzhen, is oftentimes in Foxconn, but in fact, that is a different phase of production. So that the one phase of the production, one stage of production is in Silicon Valley. One stage of production, final assembly and volume production is in Shenzhen. If you look at tools in physical manufacture, a lot of that's in Germany, in northern Italy. There are focuses into these particular points of production. So they got recomposed. That's an important part of what happened. But when you decomposed all of this, you ceased to have just an automobile sector in the United States or in Japan or in France. You had competition at each point in this production process. It was very intense. And as that happened, you had price competition. Price competition then meant, what do you do about it if you're a company? Well, that's in fact a long story, but the most interesting part of that I want to emphasize is the way in which firms that were facing physical competition at the price level started to integrate electronics into their products and change what they were selling. So that in fact you start to integrate hardware and software. My favorite example, because I did a talk a number of years ago in Finland, and I used the example, not knowing that I used the example of a crane company that in fact had faced competition from Chinese crane makers. And what they had decided to do, it was a Finnish company, was they had decided to do was buy a software company that built platforms, that built the equivalent of Windows for port management. So they then said, you can go buy a Chinese crane, but if you want to manage your port effectively, you'll buy our product and our operating system to manage your port. Komatsu, which is a Japanese construction firm, is doing very much the same kind of thing. In other words, you're not just selling the equipment, you sell the service. You'll notice that Michelin tires will, in fact, attempt to say, we'll help manage your fleet's fuel consumption. We'll provide the tires and manage when you change them, but you have to pay a fee for that. GE does that with jet engines and the like. So suddenly, what happened from this globalization, this decomposition and recomposition, was as firms started to find new ways of creating value by creating, in fact, service networks that were rooted in electronics. And that blurred, of course, services and manufacturing. It blurred as we started to have contract manufacturing, firms that started to buy production, firms that contracted for R&D from other places, including universities. Products became embedded in network services, and it was part of what we observe as this digital revolution. Now, that all happened the late 20th century, the first part of the first years of the 21st century, and then the accelerator hit. in a real sense. I want to look at it in that way. And that accelerator is abundant computing. Because earlier, each time you tried to do certain kinds of computing, if you looked at a firm like Sun Microsystems, or better still, Oracle, Oracle made its fortune by optimizing data management in vertically integrated structure to optimize the way in which its data processing system worked, because there was limited computing power just by the nature of the way in which computers actually operated. Suddenly, with the cloud, you end up with virtually unlimited computing power that's available at the price of a credit card. Now, one of my friends had told me that a few years ago she had started a firm which she sold to IBM. She sold it. She did well. She sold it for about $100 million. So that was real money back 20 years ago, right? I mean, but she sold it for about, and she said to start the company, they had to raise major capital costs to build the computers that, in fact, designed the software system that they sold to IBM. In her view, she could start the same company today in Silicon Valley with a credit card for $60,000. Now, that's why you see this enormous array of startups in the Valley, is because it doesn't cost a whole lot to run the experiment. It may cost a lot out of your own life. It may cost a lot out of other things. But all of this venture capital stuff, you know, it costs 50 cents to get started. But similarly, if you're inside of a company, you can take risks. The IT guy who was chief technical officer, chief information officer, is no longer at a choke point, because somebody can go ahead and do things on their own internal budget much more easily. So there are 4 dimensions that I need to make clear in order to make my point. Cloud is the technical foundation of this era, and platforms are, in fact, algorithms, ways of computers doing things in a series of computable steps that run in the cloud. Data is the raw material of this era, and computation-intensive automation is in many ways the thing we need to pay the most attention to. Having trouble controlling this. I don't want to go into a real discussion of cloud, but there are a few points that need to be made clear. Cloud is not a matter of where computing is done. It is a question of how it's done. It's really computing enabled by an era of abundance. And abundance facilitates virtualization and abstraction. We don't need to go into it, but it's a different way of doing computing. For the user, it makes availability of computing power very easy. It speeds the development of applications, and value moves up the value stack from infrastructure to applications. In other words, it's the applications you build, not the infrastructure that you're selling. For the provider, and it's a relevant issue for all countries outside of the United States, scale matters. And there are winner-take-all characteristics to the way in which a lot of the cloud operates, and it facilitates giants in very significant ways. The difficulty for many places is the dominant players all began by providing internally for their own needs. The providers of cloud services, Google, Amazon, Salesforce, all of which are American. So that raises it, not some great conspiracy. It is that those firms really developed a way of approaching computing to solve their own problems. So the upshot is that cloud then facilitates these drivers, platforms, data, and computation-intensive automation. I'm going to cover this quickly and focus on the third. Platforms, as I say, are digital algorithms that run in the cloud. We don't need to, in this brief discussion, really focus on what we mean by platforms, other than to say that they're sort of digital places where markets can actually form and operate. If you want, here are some formal definitions, but we don't need to really work our way through them. They're platforms of all sorts. They're services and entertainment platforms. Uber, we all know what Uber is. TaskRabbit is a labor platform in the United States. If you need to send out cleaning or you need to have somebody sort of paint your wall, you may post it on TaskRabbit and get somebody to come and do the work. And of course, we all know YouTube, that in fact are platforms that provide a whole range of things. Interesting question is who benefits from YouTube, how people make a living out of it. You have goods markets such as Amazon, where goods are bought and sold. You have labor markets, and that's in the United States at this point a very significant discussion of how platforms are affecting the way in which labor markets work. But it goes way beyond all of this. It goes into manufacturing. It goes into how you organize production over the next generation, how, in fact, firms that make, how those value chains actually operate, and how they're going to be coordinated, in which the key, just as an aside, is really going to be which firms control and dominate and define the standards, not just the platforms. Industry 4.0, the German focus on manufacturing in a platform era, is very much about this issue of trying to deal the Germans into the standards processes in industrial platforms. Internet of Things, as I say, goes well beyond the standard consumer space. The consequences are not just simply efficiency, but they are, as we all know, considerable disruption about the ability to do things radically differently. Sometimes it's a bit of efficiency about how existing markets will work. In other cases, it's changing the way in which they operate. The dominant places that the platforms are emerging, not where they're used, but where they're emerging, are in China and in the west coast of the United States, and to some extent New York. So that a real policy question becomes, how do other countries participate in this and globalize the network, the platforms that may emerge in their own local marketplaces? The fuel of this is obviously data and data analytics, the uses of the data coming out of about what we know about markets, what we know about products, what we know about who buys and sells products, how the jet engine is working. And part of the important question then becomes, who owns the data? What are the rules for the data? And we should have a clear distinction between two words: privacy and ownership on the one hand, and security on the other. Privacy and ownership are about what rights you have to keep something to yourself, and security is about your ability to do that. So that we often confuse those two terms. So that when I say who owns the data, the question is what are the legal rights about the use of that data. When we talk about security, it's the ability to actually keep the data to yourself, which matters. Leave aside the politics of this for the moment, which matters heavily to, if you're running a company, what are the distinctive intellectual property you may have in a new material or in a new way of operating something. And then we come to what I want to focus on for the few minutes remaining to me, which is the transformation of work and production with what I call computation-intensive automation. Why do we call it computation-intensive? Big, long word. Isn't that what academics do? You know, try and create terms that, in fact, nobody can understand as part of the strategy. Well, the real reason is that artificial intelligence and machine learning, which are the popular ways we hear about it, are semantically loaded. By that I mean they have meaning already embedded in the words. And the meaning that's embedded in the words, come with some of the books that even, I'm sure you have seen even here. The Robots Are Coming, The Rise of the Robots, The End of Human Society, Singularity, and the movies that sort of characterize that. They embed this notion that in one way or another, this enormous abundance of computing is going to, in fact, displace human work and human society. Now, that's a really open question. And I want to note that, in fact, some of that comes out of a study at Oxford by Fry and Osborne that says half of the work is vulnerable to displacement by robotics and software. The OECD studies say 9%, and a recent study this morning that Peter sent me this morning in the suggests, actually it's a McKinsey study, actually, so we'll give you credit for that, suggests that it will be 5% of jobs that can be displaced in any reasonable space of time. So from my vantage, the real issue is, if we only believe that a computation-intensive automation will displace jobs, we'll work to do that. And the question is, how do we create some alternate outcome? Will it displace work? We don't really know. We know it will affect it. How much of the work is actually displaced? How many jobs are created to create all of this new stuff and find new ways of using it? How much of work is actually transformed? Now, let me give you two examples of work transformation. My favorite, of course, is Microsoft Office, Microsoft Word in particular. And I say that because much of this is about the user interface between the computing systems underneath it in power and us. So back when I was starting to teach, and when many of you started in industry, if you did, there were secretarial pools. There were people who sat and typed. And in fact, those people who sat and typed, really that was their fate, and that was their, what happened to them. But in fact, with Word, all of us, Robin and myself, all of the others on the stage became typists. And all of those people who were typists, who were secretaries, became assistants doing radically different kinds of things. Work got transformed in very important kinds of ways. I visited an Italian machine tool factory a few years ago in which the very sophisticated factory ran on very sophisticated underlying hardware, but on top of it, the owners and the management had built an interface for the workforce in BASIC. Why? Because they wanted the input from the workforce who knew a lot about the products to be able to control the automated system. It was the user interface that shaped that. So the critical question is we don't know the answer, and we only can look at what influences the balance of that. Part of that is the question of what I call the algorithmic dilemma. Does innovation continuously require human input? If it does, the game continues. All of the people, what do people at Google do? They're busy creating highly automated products on an ongoing basis. And secondly, whether we view workers as an asset or a cost. If you view workers as an asset, you want to take their knowledge and find new ways of deploying it. If you see them only as a cost, then in fact you want to find ways of using these machines to get rid of the workforce. So in fact, the real question becomes, what will that balance be? And the balance isn't an inevitability. The balance really is an outcome that is a matter partly of choice. In my view, it's partly a matter of convincing. I was delighted by the McKinsey article because, in fact, only if consulting firms like McKinsey actually believe that will they convince their clients that, in fact, there are ways of proceeding other than just high degrees of automation. So that, in fact, we come back to the question, as we try to conclude, of is the digital revolution over? And I hope even from this brief discussion, one can have a sense of how deeply it's penetrating into the very way in which the economy as a whole is going to operate. It's the latest disruptive technologies. This really is just a beginning. And the question of capturing the gains is one of what and I'll conclude here, what I call the 3 Ds: development, deployment, and diffusion. What resources do you put into developing these technologies? What kind of technologies do you develop? How do you effectively deploy them? What are the corporate governance, the management strategies that, in fact, are involved, the choices that get made about how the technologies will be used? And how widely do the technologies diffuse? Now, my big hope is that the OECD study actually has an answer, which is that it will be very lucky if, in fact, the real reason that there's 10% and 90% is that we have failed at diffusion, because we can fix that. If it's really that it's all winner take all, that's a much deeper kind of problem. So development, deployment, and diffusion are the areas, whether it be a company or a government, that, in fact, decision makers actually need to focus. And let me conclude by saying when we started the Berkeley Roundtable, we started with really collaborating with a set of people who were pioneers. Bob Noyce, who founded Intel, Steve Jobs, you all know, the other semiconductor guys, and the like. And they really believed they were creating a utopia. They really believed that they were generating a new world that would be richer and better than the one that they had, in fact, grown up in. And there were skeptics at the time who believed there was a dystopia about to happen. For those of you, some of you may know the American novelist Kurt Vonnegut, and his first novel, which is written in the 1950s, is called Player Piano, and it depicts a world in which software is taken over and there are no jobs. I mean, he sort of saw this dilemma coming. So the question, I think, really is, will we end up creating this utopia? Will we capture the gains from this technology? Or we make decisions that, in fact, mean the dystopia of a jobless future is the result? And again, I think it's up to policymakers, it's up to consulting firms, it's up to universities to try and think through ways of making sure that the utopia that's possible is the one that we achieve. Thank you. For those who were interested, you can find all of this material.
Thank you very much, John. I will say as a moderator that John's presentation was a dream presentation in two regards, one in terms of its content and also in the sense that he was exactly on time. I didn't have to wave pieces of paper in his face or poke him in the ribs. And our next speaker, I'm sure, will do equally well. My old friend Peter Gourevitch from the University of California at San Diego is going to talk about the role of investment and pension fund capitalism in 21st century global capitalism. Peter?
Thanks, Robin. And right here, the red light comes on, and I'm live and not on camera, but I'm at least live, and I hope you can hear me without looking at this thing. So you see that that's the way my family spells my name, and this is how they've transliterated here, but okay, great. So I want to talk about, John IC has given a kind of a particular sectoral analysis of the economy as I've listened to the panels over the last 3 days, and I've enjoyed this very much. I want to thank Robin for inviting me to come here. I found the conversations very interesting. Some of the discussions we've had are focused upon macro issues. We've had Martin Wolf here who's one of the leading columnists from the Financial Times, and he's given some terrific presentations which focus on kind of macroeconomic policies. He made some interesting comments about, for example, the question of the interesting paradox that he's been worried about the last 10 years after the financial crisis of 2008 of the inadequacy of demand. And now he worries that the new administration in Washington, there's a risk that they're now going to spend too much money, and so we may have the paradox that the Republican administration, having complained, objected to Obama spending money. Now that they're coming in when we don't need to be spending money, they're going to spend too much. And he made that point. Paul Krugman in the New York Times made a similar point. There's kind of an interesting Keynesian concern now about policy flipping. But that's a macro view of the economy, and I don't want to do that. John gave what I would call a sectoral view of the economy, looking at a particular sector, a particularly hugely important one, and I would like to continue in that tradition by pointing at a sector, worrying about some of the micro institutions of finance, raising the same question, what will contribute to growth and stability, and I want to explore what are the linkages among savings, investment, and corporate governance, institutional investors, and sovereign wealth funds, because I think there are some pieces in there that we don't pay adequate attention to about how the micro institutions and the discussions about some of the big consequences of the financial crisis of 2008. A lot of attention was paid to how do we rescue or reorganize some of the financial institutions. A lot of very important work was done there. But I've always thought that there are some pieces that we have not adequately looked at in there that involve corporate governance and the details of that. By the way, one thing that I think is quite fascinating in all that is that I think one of the things to understand about the political consequences, Martin Wolf made this point a couple days ago, that 10 years after the financial crisis of 2008, we are seeing the political consequences of it in the elections of this year in Brexit and the elections of Donald Trump, as we see the repercussions of very substantial changes in the political economy of the industrialized world. And I think a particularly important thing to understand, and one of the interesting debates that goes on is, are people responding to changes in the objective life situation, or are they responding to the expression of kind of a resentment about a change in the culture of their life and in a change in who's getting attention and who's not. is there a resentment being expressed? And in my reading of the past year, I found a particularly fascinating thing I read. The Nobel Prize winning, your Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich, second-hand time. When I looked up what the Russian for that was, I discovered that it is Vremya Second-hand. It's the same title, which surprised me. But anyway, I read that, and I thought that was quite an extraordinary account of how people felt when life around them changes very profoundly. And I thought it expresses very well a kind of resentment that you see around the world. And I think it's relevant here because one of the striking columns to me, after President-elect Trump won, there was an article in the New York Times by Gretchen Morgenson. Gretchen Morgenson is one of the leading business economists, writers of the New York Times. And she writes on financial economics and things like that. And she wrote a column in which she said that the very day after the election, she said that had the finance industry in New York, had more people gone to jail, that this was an expression, to some degree, she thought the result was an expression of the tremendous resentment felt by many people that after the financial disaster of 2008, many of the people who had brought it about suffered very little about it. The energy was put on rescuing the economy. That Geithner and Summers, in advising Obama, had urged him to put all their energy into rescuing the economy, bringing the financial system back into health, and very good policies to do that, and they succeeded, but that nobody seems to have paid a price for the really pretty catastrophic things that they had done, and that expressed a tremendous amount of resentment. People felt the financial sector was being bailed out, but middle America was not. And I think for Gretchen Morgenson to say that, I thought was really quite an extraordinary thing and an important thing to us. And so that leads to the comments that I want to explore, was what are the micro-institutional issues that I think have not been talked about very much. The energy has gone into thinking about the banking sector and what kinds of regulations we have in the banking sector. I think there are some other micro-institutional issues about corporate governance, investment, and pension funds, which I think have a lot of implications for Russia, for countries all over the world and policies they make, because I think these have to do with regulatory policy about how countries structure and regulate these different micro-institutions, and so I think they're worth thinking about. Let me just articulate a couple of these, which struck me as particularly important. I think there are some classic problems which we think have been solved, but in my opinion have not been solved. Their corporate governance issues have remained very severe between shareholders and managers. Issues about institutional investors, which I think vary quite a lot. There tends to be a tendency to talk about institutional investors as if they're a large homogeneous category, and they are not. And I will go through these in detail as I go through my quick analysis. First, the problem about managerial agency costs and corporate governance. You're probably all familiar with the classic book of Burl Means, The Modern Corporation, that came out in the 30s, which pointed out that the firm was run by managers, not the owners or shareholders. Because of the Depression of '29, there was a very substantial regulatory reform process that began with the creation of the Securities Exchange Commission, and it went on for many, many years, and it created essentially this model, which is a stylized version of the Anglo-American model of corporate governance, which is that you have a mass of small shareholders. You do not have concentrated shareholding. You have a mass of small shareholders who elect the board of directors, and that board of directors is supposed to monitor the senior manager. That is, and then you create a whole lot of shareholder protections to make sure that that system works, that the small shareholders are protected in being able to do that. And that is a classification of shareholder protection across country. That's a very nice idea, but the trouble is it doesn't work very well, as people have come to understand. The reason being that there's a massive collective action problem here. If you have a mass of small shareholders, you actually have a problem, which is who has actually an interest, the ability, and an interest in the means to actually organize for the supervision of the managers, and the answer is nobody. So that in the end of the day, you have a mass of shareholders, small shareholders. You've prevented blockholder manipulation of the small shareholders, but actually nobody has an incentive to pay very careful attention to what the managers are up to. So one of the solutions that came along to that problem was the very great idea that came out about 30 years ago was let's have the alignment of incentives. We're going to give managers the incentive to pay attention to the concerns of the shareholders. We're going to pay them with options. We're going to give them a large quantities of shares. That way they will themselves become shareholders, and by doing so they will worry about the concerns of the small shareholders. So we will pay them with options and stuff like that. But the trouble that then produced, that then gradually people started, that's what happened in the United States and in the UK to some degree, but the trouble with that is it gradually became clear that it started to create some divergence of interest between the mass of small shareholders and the managers, because the managers started to have some incentive to take bigger risks than the small shareholders might actually have liked. And so that, to me, seems to me an element about where corporate governance and the financial crisis start to interact. So that's one of my complaints, is a lot of the energy with the solutions to financial crisis has focused on banking regulation. It has not paid very much attention to what are the elements of the corporate governance system that has occurred, incentivize this, so that actually there's been endless talk about managerial pay and whether managerial pay contributes to this, but there's been very little talk about doing anything about it, about what could you actually do in the system of whether boards of directors, which pay actually very little attention to it, could anything be done about that? So what are the solutions to that? Well, one of the nice solutions about that could be block holding. Remember, I said the problem about the American model of a mass of a few shareholders was there's a collective action problem. Nobody really has an interest to pay very much attention or has the means to go after the managers and say the pay package you're demanding is pretty outrageous, and actually you didn't do very much to deserve it. How could you do that? Well, you suppose you had institutional investors who had the blocks, sufficiently large blocks of shares, to actually do something about it and pay attention. That's actually the European model, right? By European model, I'm being crude. Let me say Germany. Wolfgang Streeck is up there. He can correct me when I'm wrong. That's the classic German model, where you have a dominant block holder who owns a very large block of shares, as a result of which that block holder can sit on a board of directors and can pay more careful attention, has an incentive to make more careful attention to what is going on. So block holders actually might have more incentive to pay attention to it. Why not combine these systems and have institutional investors having the ability, having bigger shares of blocks of shares, and have more attention to pay what was going on. So there was a lot of talk about that. There was a lot of literature about, and there still is, a lot of literature about giving institutional investors a larger percentage, give them the ability and the means to pay attention to what managers are doing. But it turns out that's not so easy either, because it turns out that there are more than one kind of institutional investor. The literature that I've read that tries to follow this says that, well, institutional investors behave in different ways. Some of them will actually use their shares to pay attention, and some of them won't, because there are different kinds of institutional investors. Some of the institutional investors actually don't have much of an incentive, even if they own a fair number of blocks of shares, don't have much of an incentive to monitor the managers, because actually they are making money from their relationship to the corporation in other ways. For example, they're providing accounting services, consulting services, and other things. So it turns out that there are different kinds of institutional investors which vary quite a lot in their incentive to carry out this kind of supervisory or managerial function that we want. An example that I found quite interesting when I was studying this was the distinction between CalPERS and Vanguard on one hand versus Fidelity, the difference being that Fidelity...
CalPERS is, people don't know.
What? Oh, I'm sorry. My great apologies. I live in California, and like you living in California, forget that the rest of the world, so... Everybody doesn't know California. We do not all. The New York Times thinks that we all have hot tubs and lawns, and that's really...
Only Peter.
And that's not true. That's really not true. CalPERS is the California Public Pension Fund, or one of them. It's not the one. Interesting, I work at the University of California, and we're under a different one. So there are several different structures, but CalPERS is a shorthand for a California Public Pension Fund, and it's a gigantic one. And in one, I'm going to talk later about sovereign wealth funds, and in some studies of them, it's listed as one of them. But it is a public pension fund. So it's the pension fund of state employees. And so one of the interesting structures is that you have quite a lot of these in the U.S., all over the world. You have a lot of very interesting institutional investors, which are essentially the pension funds of different kinds of employees. Public sector ones is CalPERS in the state of Ohio has one of these, and all the states have one of these. As I was studying these, they're interesting one. There's like the Dutch railway workers is another. Some of them are, so there's a whole bunch of institutions like that, and they're quite different in their properties and their behavior than what you could call the private institutional investors, of which Fidelity is a very famous one, or Merrill Lynch is very famous ones. These are very famous, huge American institutional investors, and they're quite different because CalPERS has no shareholders. CalPERS is a publicly structured funds. There's an interesting contrast between Vanguard and Fidelity, which is that Vanguard Vanguard is a company, is a private company, not a public sector employee fund. It's a private company, but all of Vanguard shares are owned by the funds that make it up, whereas in the case of Fidelity, there's a separate set of shareholders which is private. The Johnson family owns Fidelity and then has contracts with the various mutual funds so that the shareholders of Fidelity have an incentive to make money from the mutual funds that they are managing, whereas CalPERS has no set of private shareholders. And in the case of Vanguard, all the profits, whatever they get from fees, flow back to Vanguard because the pension funds own it. So the CalPERS and Vanguard and TIAA-CREF, which is another set of pension funds, they're not in any tension or competition with their shareholders. With their retirees or their pensioners. And this is really quite interesting because it turns out that when you study how they behave as monitors of the managers, there's been quite a big difference in how they actually behave. And one of the things that turned out was that the Fidelity types would not announce how they were voting their shares. Right? So they couldn't play that function. They were not voting their shares as monitors. And one of the interesting things about recent regulation is it was demanding that these institutional investors make public how they were actually voting their shares. And that is now, because of the debate about changing Dodd-Frank and other regulation, it's no longer clear what's actually going to happen. Another interesting difference with TIAA and CalPERS is they actually have representation on their boards of the people who are actually the owner of the pension funds. That's not true in the privately owned ones. So I think these are very interesting institutional differences in institutional investors, and I think it matters a great deal if we have conversations about privatization. With the change of privatization of pension funds, with the change of politics in the U.S., this may or may not be back on the table. The last time there was a Republican president, George Bush, the second George Bush, actually talked about doing it and ran into a buzzsaw of opposition. The Republicans in Congress found that there was tremendous public hostility towards doing this. It will be very interesting to see whether this comes back on the table, because there are Republican members of Congress who actually take seriously the idea of doing this. Will the public understand the difference or not is a very interesting question. To me, I'm not in favor of it for a variety of reasons I want to go through, but the point I want to make is that if we ever do such a thing, I would like to pay very careful attention to the nature of the financial institutions in which it's not public versus private, but what are the nature of the institutions to whom that get to take these pension funds. And let me give you an example of Chile, which I studied for a while, where this has actually happened. A while back, the World Bank said to Chile and to many other countries, you know, too much government, Washington consensus kind of thing, take the government out of the economy, privatize your pension funds. And so the Chileans started to do this. And this then, after 10 years, ran into a tremendous buzzsaw of a storm of controversy as politics moved back and forth, because it turned out that the people who did that were actually making a poorer rate of return. The privatized pension funds were doing worse than the people who you actually had a choice. You could have left your money with the regular, with the state-run one, or you could put it in these privatized ones. The people who went private were doing worse. And the analysis as to why they were doing worse was that the particular institutions in which they put them were charging high fees for managing the funds. Okay, if you play back the slides, in a way what happened was the Chileans did not pay attention to the details of what kind of institutions were given the right to manage these funds, and they put them in the hands of the equivalent of Fidelity rather than the equivalent of CalPERS or Vanguard or TIAA-CREF. And that made a difference over a 10-year period in what happened to the fees and where the fees went, and that makes a very big difference in your rate of return. And everybody knows this, but if you don't pay very careful attention to regulation, the savers don't know this all that well, and so you're actually going to get quite a very big difference in what happens to people. So then that led to a lot of controversy in the presidential elections as they moved back and forth in Chile. They had to come in a rescue package. The people were so angry that they had lost, and they did that. That allows me to make, I think I have the time to make one quick point about another point of annoyance about policy towards Chile, which connects back to corporate governance. One of the things as I was working on this, I discovered that in Chile was that you may be aware of the fact that when the Pinochet government in Chile came into office, this was the conservative government after the coup there, it was advised very heavily by free market people from the University of Chicago, known as the Chicago Boys. And the Chicago Boys were very heavy on recommending to the Pinochet government that the Chilean government be deregulated, assets privatized, things, a market economy would be just what Chile wanted. What fascinated me when I was studying corporate governance with a colleague, Jim Shin, and we were working on this, was we discovered that what the Chicago Boys paid no attention to the issue of corporate governance. They paid no attention to who actually owned the assets and what the degree of concentration or monopoly control was in Chile, so that one of the most concentrated economies in the entire world by our indices was Chile. It had the most concentrated shareholding because they have a cross-shareholding system in Chile, so that small minority positions through cross-holding can lead to an extraordinary concentration control. And so to call that a market economy seems bizarre. I mean, technically it's privatized, but in fact there are very few rules that make sure there's any kind of serious competition. So that strikes me as another interesting regulatory issue. You want, I'll take it back, you can, but it's in my book. You can find it in my book. You don't have to take a slide from it. I'm happy to send you the reference. It's by now old data, for which I apologize, but I don't think that piece of it has changed all that much. The point I'm trying to make simply here is, again, that there are a lot of these petty, detailed regulatory issues about corporate governance, financial institutions, and all these, which make a difference in what actually happens. A third case, which is very much in the news, is on sovereign wealth funds. I was very struck as I was preparing. Suddenly, you know, the Wall Street Journal came out with a very interesting article on sovereign wealth funds, and it showed the extraordinary variance that exists in what happens to them and how well they're doing. That some of them, that's a tremendous amount of money in the sovereign wealth funds, but that some of them, as asset prices, oil and other prices have gone down in some countries, these sovereign wealth funds are being used as essentially piggy banks by governments who are using it to bail out big projects that they had started when energy prices were high and they couldn't afford them. And so these are really very interesting as how in other countries, sovereign wealth funds are doing very well and remain very stable. So I began kind of read up for this. I was thinking about this talk. I began looking around, and I found that Truman at the Peterson Institute has a rating of sovereign wealth funds, and I read through it, and I was really quite fascinated by it, but I thought that it had some of the same problems that ratings of institutional investors did, is that it did not. It gave you lots of indices and a lot of information, but it didn't sort out, in my opinion, well enough some of the issues. It didn't weight enough questions of the government as to who ran them, who had a voice in them, who controlled how free of political interference they were. So that is my conclusion, and Robin, I'm hoping I'm going to also get a red star or an apple on my desk from you and finishing on time. The point that I'm trying to make about all this is that very big policy issues are faced here in Russia and by countries all over the world. The United States, I think that there are flaws in the systems everywhere, and there are difficult challenges being faced, because I think that these micro-institutional issues about pension funds, private and public ones, institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds, all of them, there are some micro details about who regulates them, the corporate governance issues in them, and how that relates to corporate governance issues, which I think have quite a lot of consequences about stability and prospects for growth. I'm a political scientist. I'm not an economist or a business school professor by nature. My interest in all of this stuff is because I have interested in the politics of the regulatory response. I became interested in all this stuff, doing all this stuff, because I wanted to know why the corporate governance system has differed so deeply around the industrialized world, why they were, and I wanted to know what, in a way, the political support was for or against different reforms. And so I was very struck. I'll give just a quick example that one of the interesting things happening, the Republicans in the United States, I'm not a Republican, I think that's probably very obvious to you from my talks, but one of the things that's been fascinating to me is that the discourse in the United States for the past 15 years has been that the GOP talks itself about making the world good for shareholders. And the interesting question is, what actually happens in the regulatory world when issues of shareholders come up? Because the Dodd-Frank, remember the Obama administration and the response to the crisis of 2008, one of the responses to the crisis of 2008 was a regulatory reform of Dodd-Frank, which was going to bring in a bunch of changes about finance and financial institutions and consumer protection, and it did bring in some changes that are relevant to what I'm talking about how institutional investors were to vote with their pension funds and things, declare how they were voting in pension funds. Well, Trump and the GOP in the last election campaigned about getting rid of Dodd-Frank. Well, it's very hard to know from campaign to what actually will happen. I don't think I avidly watch the news. I get up here, and that's yesterday afternoon in the U.S. You watch the news, you try to understand what in the world's going on back there, and it's very hard. The general thing, nobody knows between the rhetoric and reality what will actually happen. But it seems very clear over the last 10 years that strong Republican majorities mean a weaker SEC, weaker consumer protection, weaker banking regulation, weaker shareholder protection, more rules that CEOs like, more rules that weaken shareholder protection, more weaker efforts to pay any attention to things about executive pay. And so those things in partisan terms, at least in the United States, really do fall out in a left-right basis. Every so often you find, I can think of several examples, there was a couple of cases of Republican nominees on the Securities Exchange Commission over the past 25 years who tried very hard to take seriously that minority shareholder protection was a strong business attitude, that it would make for a healthier economy. They tried very hard to do this, and they ran into a lot of political opposition. So it seems to me that that the political balance of this in the U.S. is that it's very hard for conservative majorities are less likely to do these kinds of things than happens if there are stronger Democratic majorities. Whether they do it or not is not very clear. But that's, by and large, what I see happening in the U.S. It would take a lot more work to be in a comparative. There are regulatory reforms that happen in other countries over the past 15 years on some of these issues, and it's one of my interests has been to try to track out what political changes bring that about there. It's one of the things I find very interesting about Russia is under what conditions what conditions are the politics about shareholders and governments produce different kinds of policies. Well, that's my thoughts, and thanks for the opportunity to present them. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you, Peter. And you do have a red star, and you are within your time limit. So far, we have heard two views from the United States, from the West Coast of the United States. I'm from New York, so although I've been there, I'm not exactly sure where California is, but I think I know. But in any case, we're now going to shift to the Russian context, and I'm going to ask two of our, we do know where Russia is, we're here, all of us do, and I'm going to ask our two Russian commentators to begin, and then we'll take a step back again to a European view. I'm going to call first, if I might, on Yermolai Solzhenitsyn to offer his comments. I'll ask commentators to keep to about 10 minutes. Then we'll go back and forth among the panelists for a few minutes, and then we'll throw things open to general questions and discussion. Yermolai?
English or Russian?
English.
Okay. Thank you, Robin. Commentary on what? On the topic of the session, or on the previous presentations, or is there a particular question?
Just as you wish, certainly with reference to the presentation.
Open format. I mean, I guess let me refer back to the title of our session, which is, as far as I understand, kind of the contours of the global economy and kind of the challenges this presents to Russia. So I think that especially let's then think about what are the main elements of the international system today, of the international situation, which are challenging for Russia. Many of them were referred to by in the previous presentations. So you have the commodity cycle, which is now in a lower phase, and certainly dents very significantly our traditional sources of income as a nation and the government's fiscal position. So what has happened basically has led to the fact that the government budget in the Russian Federation is no longer a source of stimulating economic growth for the next few years at least. There's a budget deficit of 4%. There isn't this absolutely a potential to grow debt. It's a very low state debt. But we are in a situation where the government cannot, quote unquote, kind of spend its way out of anything. It can't spend its way into anything either. Very interesting to hear that Trump is thinking about, this whole infrastructure program and government spending. This has been a debate in Russia, but the funny thing is that the debate seems weird to me because everybody quite often is saying, the only way we can do this is if we attract capital from abroad. So the first point is, can Russia attract the capital, including from all these pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and so on? Many sessions during this forum about that. So far, and the number one, let's say, topic this number I would keep in mind, is Russia right now has 17% of GDP is investments, and a very similar number, 18% of GDP is small and medium-sized enterprises. That is not sustainable. Both of those, well, one of them is sustainable. It's been like that for more than a century, of course. The small and medium-sized enterprises, and even the last 10 years, every single minister of national economy talks about how it's unacceptable and we have to go above 25, and most countries, by the way, kind of 40 to 45, 50%, or not most countries, but developed countries you'd want to be similar to, 40 to 45. We have 20. So in Russia, I would say that the issue is, how the hell do we get people to start businesses? How do we get people to invest? And I think when people talk about investment, there's all this discussion about, the central bank has too high a rate. Guys, every single year for the last 6 years, 60 billion, 70 billion, 80 billion, $100 billion is leaving the country. it's leaving the country to find returns that are international returns. So that's the relevant metric. So if they are preferring to go for 4% or 5% or 7% return somewhere else, then the problem, almost to me, intellectually by definition, is not that the Russian banks are having very high rates, but that that the alternative of either projects are not here or the risks are very high. So I think that for the Russia context, this is the first thing. I mean, the challenge for Russia, therefore, is how do you decrease concentration in the economy, how do you attract investments, and how do you increase competition across all spheres of life? That's the Russian kind of agenda. Now, turning to the global trends, how do you use what's going on in the world to help to solve that? So in my mind, there's several things. One is, on the one hand, Russia is big. I mean, it was before devaluation, 7th economy in the world. I think now it's, 10th or 11th or something like this. On the other hand, it's 10% of China GDP, right? It's, I guess about the same percent of America. So if you think about Russia, America, and China as two big pillars in the world thinking about the future, Russia is exactly 5% of that whole economic pie. It's not a player. So it's a country. It's with a meaningful size, population, meaningful size. So Russia has to understand that if we decide not to play, in the end, no one cares. If we decide not to play militarily, if we decide not to play in, how we behave militarily internationally, that is important. How we behave in the nuclear policy, how we behave in the UN National Security Council. But if we decide to say that, we won't buy somebody's agricultural products, or we will buy somebody's agricultural products, or we will, be allies with one country or another country, the fact of the matter is that it's not going to change the equation globally too much. And psychologically, it's very hard for a nation who, during the whole 20th century, or conglomeration of nations, was a superpower, to understand that just, economically it's not. Which then means, okay, there's a saying in Russia, to punish my mom, I'll go freeze my ears. Like when mom says, come back from outside, from the house this time. Just to really, So, the question is, like, when we try to say that, we will do this or we will do that, or economically, who are we hurting more, ourselves or others? And to me, especially in this world that is so amazingly, so accelerated, going so fast, what we need to do is we need to embrace the outside world as much as we can. Culturally, socially, and economically. It can only benefit us. We're not the incumbent. All right, and there's absolutely zero downside. Now, of course, you have to be ready, which that may mean some of this job loss, it may mean some of these changes, but it's pretty clear that there's absolutely zero examples. I can't find an example of a country which has moved successfully through an era through protecting and isolating itself. I don't know, maybe you can name one. I mean, the extreme cases everybody knows about, Albania before, North Korea, but just in general. And this whole protectionism that is now kind of going to come up in the world a bit, again, you have to be very careful about what degrees of protectionism will be happening and how high will it really be happening. So to me, Russia needs to embrace the world as much as possible. It's a political decision. We're not doing it. The West also needs to understand, and that's a debate you can have with U.S. policymakers, first of all, but also EU. What does the U.S. want from Russia? What does the EU want from Russia? Does the U.S. and the EU want, integration, trade, friendship, common values, or does it want to say that actually, we want to change the political system here? Now, the official line is, of course, we would never want to do that. But the fact is that, of course, looking from Russia policymakers' point of view, there's probably about 10, 15, 20 countries around the world where you see the kind of, it looks like at least that the second goal is the one that's being pursued. This whole sanctions topic, I always wonder, okay, we have the case of Iran. Iran is a great, very scientifically complete case of sanctions. They started in, 1979 or whenever they started. Retrospective analysis, what has this brought? What has this achieved? And by the way, at which stage did it trigger which kinds of behaviors? By whom? I'm not in any way a specialist in Middle Eastern history or current affairs, but my impression is it probably hurt the population. It's probably fairly neutral to the power, to the guys in charge. Probably strengthened the position of those in charge vis-a-vis like some other potential guys in charge, and probably didn't do a hell of a lot to accelerate anything or change the economy in any way. Maybe even exacerbated this whole thing with the nuclear program. Did it create any benefits? Did it accelerate the return of Iran to the national community? Did it create pressures bottom up from the population to help, democratic elections or whatever in Iran? I mean, I don't know. But it just seems like, so what's the objective? So again, if this session is conceived as a bit of a, not conversation between, but about kind of how Russia in the global, I think one question for all these new leaders in different countries in the West is think, what do we really want with Russia, and what are we really trying to achieve? But for Russia, regarding of whatever the West is doing, I would always say, not turn the other cheek in terms of the philosophy of it, but always say, you know what, but I still want to embrace. Fine, I have sanctions, 10, 25 people can't go, sanctions can't go. I will triple the amount of university delegations that go to the States or want to go to the States. I will quadruple the amount of, invitations. Not because I'm nice, not because I want to, but because I can only win from it. I am not the incumbent. And I think that really is philosophy, which of course we're not at all practicing now. But that's the one I would say. And just to finish up this round of comments, this whole digital thing. The digital thing, it's, of course, I fully agree. It's fully real. It's only accelerating. It's changing the world in amazing ways. And especially when I think about how it's changing the world, and several things I would say. First of all, it's getting rid of intermediaries. Getting direct to the end user, even jumping through different industries of your product, is becoming not only possible, but increasingly is what's happening. People go direct. The taxi driver and the taxi passenger do not need a dispatcher or a phone number to find each other in Uber. Same thing with all these, sites and all these hotels and Airbnbs and Amazons. When you order Amazon, you're not talking to a person. Moreover, Amazon's now got 30,000 robots, probably 100,000 by now, who are working in all the warehouses. People are just not involved. So people are disappearing, intermediaries are disappearing. This is the way the plan is going. Now that matters for Russian companies, of course, because especially as we export, we often don't know where the hell this goes. We export steel, metal, chemicals. We have some distribution company there. What happens later? You can get blindsided by people disrupting those channels. So I would say for any country like Russia, which does need to export and not just commodities, you have to be careful about channels, control of channels. And in general, in today's world, this kind of shares. The other thing is capex. Russia has little money to invest. You have to be very careful about how to invest. A lot of these technologies are completely disrupting the asset-heavy parts of value chains. So we even talk about 3D printing. I think the things like that. I mean, you can't cover everything. Big discontinuities. The good news is that no one's really that far ahead in these technologies. So in theory, you could be at the same playing field. The bad news is, of course, unfortunately, we're very sluggish, and generally we tend to just talk about this stuff at different conferences, but no one's really doing anything. And the reason nobody's doing anything is exactly the fact that you only will do this kind of stuff if you need to make your objective. If you need to keep your job, if you need to make your target, if you need to preserve your plant from being closed, if you need to avoid bankruptcy, right? And if on the whole, anyway, it's fine to kind of muddle along, then nobody in their right mind in any country of the world will not deal with innovation or changing your business model or firing half the people or hiring other people. Why would you bother? So while you have all these conversations and endless commissions and discussions and modernization, innovation, you will only do this, and this is true in California and Wisconsin, in Shenzhen, in Johannesburg, in Sweden, and here, you will only do this if you need it to meet the objective. And Russia has low competition, fairly high margins actually, at least historically. No one really needs to innovate to kind of make it to the next year, whether in the government system or in the private sector. So I would say, to summarize my view, I think the ball is in Russia's court in terms of how Russia wants to develop in the 21st century. We're not doing a good job of having a conversation about it or about defining our behavioral paradigm. The kind of passively emerging behavioral paradigm is more of the kind of muddle through, we protect ourselves, especially if, we're tit for tat kind of mindset. but being not the incumbent, but being in a way a challenger or somebody that's not clear how we're functioning in the modern world, that's a little bit, again, the, freeze your ears off to, make mom upset kind of behavior. So those are just some thoughts, Robin.
Thank you very much, Yermolai. Thank you. Mikhail Pryadilnikov?
I wanted to thank John and Peter for a wonderful presentation. I was thinking first that John really convinced us that we're in the middle of this great technical and digital revolution, at least convinced me, and then Peter convinced all of us that, well, it's not quite enough to stop those centrifugal forces that are affecting at least the Western Europe and the United States. We see that it's not quite solving the problem with inequality yet. Maybe at some point it will transform the global economy, but it's not having an effect globally to say that the world is, while it's being connected digitally and using platforms of various kinds, it's sort of being pulled apart, at least at the European Union level, and the U.S. also is probably going to pull away from certain trade deals. And I would agree with Yermolai on the thesis that Russia's future depends on its global integration in the global economy. I think it's clear that we're not going to succeed if we are friends with just one part of the world and not the other. We have to solve this political issue. And the second one is this the biggest issue for Russia is to solve the structural reform problem, which we've been talking about for the past, 15 years. And it's clear, it seems to politicians what should be done. It's the reducing role of the state, it's increasing competition, it's creating a good investment climate. But for various reasons, this hasn't happened yet. And I know Peter wrote a lot in his other papers about the role of politics on corporate governance. And the example of Chile is very telling, the fact that Chilean reformers first focused on privatization, and it's very similar to what happened in the 1990s when the primary goal was to transfer the state ownership to private hands, and then think about corporate governance later. That's exactly what happened. And the high concentration of ownership in the 90s moved to high concentration of state ownership in 2000s. We now have an economy of about 70% state control. And so if we talk about corporate governance rules in Russia, the focus will probably going to be less on institutional investors, because the pension funds and the big banks are only starting to play a role in corporate governance, but more on the way the state manages companies. The state plays a role. And of course, the state needs to get rid of some of its functions and some sectors of the economy, but also improve its corporate governance. And in 2014, I want to remind everyone, there was a new corporate governance code that was passed. And now, if we look at the central bank data, about 60% of 83 companies, top companies that were surveyed, already utilizing this code and applying this code. 13 companies, the major state corporations like Gazprom and Rosneft and Aeroflot, they've adopted pretty much all of the aspects of this corporate governance code. It's voluntary, and it's probably the best of what we can find globally on disclosure of information, on management controls that were integrated into this corporate governance code. But it's one of the maybe technical steps that were passed, and structural reform does not end there. But it's an example where some technical things are happening, maybe locally, but globally, I think we should look further. And I just want to bring back to yesterday's address by Alexei Kudrin. And if we recall his priorities that he outlined, one of these priorities was governance reform. I think it was number one. And he viewed that as, John, if you remember, he called it government as a platform. which is something I want to leave us thinking about. Right now, we're talking about private sector as a platform, and we had various sort of platforms that John used as an example. One is services and trade, and great examples that we all know: Uber, Amazon, Google using. Actually, I just this morning I've read an article about a startup. You've heard about Amazon stores that you can come in and basically there are no salespeople anymore. There is an eatery, there is a first fast food that you can come in and just order your food and this brings up to you. This is obviously going to expand, and John's absolutely right that we don't know what the impact is going to be on the human capital, on kind of labor transformation that is going to happen, what kind of skills will be required. But we're also not addressing yet what's going to be the impact of the government and what roles government should play in this new digital economy. And one of the ideas that we're thinking about now is possibly sort of going ahead and transforming government institutions and having government as a platform. Basically, government moving away from direct provision of services, but providing opportunities for private players, for clients, citizens, to have direct access to the kind of services they need. It's kind of a revolutionary idea, and I think only some countries and some states have tried it. I know that Singapore has an IT initiative of this kind. But I think we need to look and think about that. What kind of platform should we create? How we'll get connected to the private platforms? If we want to simplify services for citizens, what are the technologies that can allow us in the near future to help us do that?
Thank you, Mikhail. Let me now give 2 minutes to each. Oh, sorry, Mathilde. I'm so sorry. Mathilde goes next, please.
Yeah. Try to take seriously the instructions, like to comment more on what the presenter said, and but it's kind of challenging. It's quite broad. Just about your first presentation, obviously I agree strongly with what you said. Like it is just starting, and then I might want to develop a bit on your last point. That was, we need to develop, deploy, and diffuse, and I think we need to be bigger than that and broader than that to embrace the digital, economy and the digital, like, to make sure we can face all the challenges, the disruption that you were describing, and transform this digital economy into opportunities also to solve the big problems that we are all facing, whether the US, Russia, Europe, etc., in terms of climate change, aging economies, infrastructure, in terms of also inequality, especially in terms of refugee crisis, etc. I think the digital economy could give us ways to face these challenges. But for that, I think we need a very broad approach to this digital challenge. And it's not only diffusion, and you mentioned the work that we did recently at the OECD on the best and the rest, this issue that where we saw looking at the productivity slowdown at the micro level, looking at the firms that are starving, like the global frontier firms and the laggards, and seeing that this divergence in productivity growth is growing. So we saw from this finding, we are trying to figure out what are the dynamics behind this. And of course, there is this winner-takes-all dynamic that is happening for sure, that is, of course, reinforced by the digital characteristics, like, scaling without mass, etc., all these phenomenon. But there is also a problem of diffusion, as you mentioned, because the larger firms are not less and less able to benefit from these new innovations, and we have probably an increasing problem in market contestability in competition, and that's very worrisome. But I think if we want to embrace this digital challenge and this digital opportunity, we need to reset the rules of the global economy. And at the OECD, we have just launched a big project that we call the Horizontal Project. That means we try to look at one issue from all different perspectives of policy making, like from the social policy area, from environmental policies, from governance, public governance, etc., etc. So we try to look at it from very many different angles and to see what needs to be done. And we have identified already, we're just at the beginning, but we had a big conference in Berlin this week about that. And we have already identified like 11 areas where we need to focus, and especially at the global level in cooperating within the G20, but not only the G20, obviously. And so I will just list them to see that it's much broader than only development, deployment, and diffusion, because it goes the whole in the whole fabric of our economics and political systems. So we need to close access and usage gaps, so that to ensure that the internet works for all, and that's a big challenge. We need, of course, to increase investment in digital infrastructures. We need to foster financing of digital infrastructure, so that goes also with your how to ensure that finance is going there, and that's linked to corporate governance, of course, but not only. We need to develop standards and interoperability. Sorry, to support what you were mentioning, the Internet of Things and the Industry 4.0. We need to work on competition issues. That's quite important and quite challenging. The way we frame our competition policies has to change. We need a very new approach to competition, especially, of course, in the ICT sector, but not only in the ICT sector. We need to work on privacy and security risk management. It's not the same, but we need both of them to support trust in this new digital economy. And then we need to have very broad strategies to ensure that people have the skills necessary to embrace this new era. So that means the skills, the generic digital skills, so that everybody can use it. The very specialist skills for the engineers, the people working on data, etc., but also the complementary skills, so that the usual ones like literacy, numeracy, also critical thinking, emotional, social skills, etc. So that's a big challenge to make sure that we could have inclusive, digital economy that works for all. There is the question of SMEs, and it's related to what you said about Russia. You need to make sure that the SME that are the backbone of economic growth in most countries, and not in Russia, unfortunately, but that they could embrace this revolution. You need to promote consumer protection for trust issues also. And reset basically a large part of our legal framework, And the problem is that, law does not change quickly, and the digital economy is changing very quickly. So how we can get organized to embrace that quickly. So that's a whole program. And to go back to what you were saying about government, yes, this is a whole of government project, in fact. And we need to try to make the policymakers not reactive but proactive to these changes. And the governments need to learn to become digital and to become agile to manage this big change. So it's quite challenging. A couple of words on your presentation on corporate governance. I fully agree with everything you said about the history, of this idea of corporate governance, the defense of minority, and then you need to work with institutional investors, etc. But I think we need to, if we want to answer this angriness that is rising in our countries in the West, like in Europe or in the US, and I agree that it might be the repercussion of the crisis, 10 years afterwards. And in my country, in France, we are also facing elections that are quite dangerous in the spring. I think we need to be a little bit more ambitious than that, and maybe we need to reconsider the very shareholder model of corporate governance and adopt a more stakeholder approach to that. You know, it's not only the investors that are having risk when they invest in the company, the workers, etc. So I think we might be a little bit more broad in the changes we want. And to your speech, I find it very interesting what you suggest, that to embrace outside world and getting rid of protectionisms, etc. And I think you might know that Russia was engaged in the accession to the OECD, and I think the idea was that to embrace the outside world and make use of all these rules that we have been discussing and developing at among OECD countries. And for obvious reasons, and that, of course, I don't want to discuss here, this process is stopped for the time being. But we are still, like, the idea is still, and it comes from the Russian government as well as from the OECD, like, to continue cooperation for exactly this idea, like, we need to embrace Russia within our discussions also in terms of international cooperation. I think that's, yeah, I'm done.
Thank you, Mathilde. Let me just give each of our speakers 2 minutes to respond. 3. See how forceful he is? And then we'll throw it open to questions. John?
Those are very useful remarks, all 3 of them, and I want to quickly respond in sort of an integrated way. It's obvious that the politics, the geopolitics of the current situation make embrace difficult. And it becomes an issue of how does one embrace if one, in fact, is threatened by the embrace, and how do we get out of that particular situation. That said, I think there are a couple of things that need to be added, and then some suggestions, perhaps, on strategy. 2 issues which I didn't really mention in my talk, which need noting in this context. One is that security issues of the net, this broadly now internet-based system, are real issues, quite apart from the geopolitics of who hacks whom. The vulnerability of an energy system, the vulnerability of a heating system is extreme, and therefore the question of how we are all going to address those vulnerabilities, quite apart from the politics of it, is also an opportunity, because in fact there's not a lot of work that's been done. There's a lot of investment that might be done. And it's an interesting question. As you're building out a system, can you build out a system that, in fact, engenders the basis of trust? Related to that, of course, since Peter and I have known each other a long time, and so there's an ongoing banter, but that would say that I don't address enough of the politics. An important part of the platform issue is that platforms are private governance systems. That is, they are sets of rules embedded in code, and those often stand in counterpart to the way in which government or public rules actually operate. Some of us remember the book of Larry Lessig, who's an American professor of the law, who wrote a book called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, which basically said there was East Coast code, which was laws, and West Coast code, which was law, which was code. And if you could say whatever you wanted about your values, but if it wasn't expressed in the code, it wasn't going to exist. And so I think that it's an interesting issue as these questions of government start to be open. So the opportunity, however, is can Russia really take 2 or 3 domains where there are needs to fulfill anyway? Reorganizing government, addressing oil issues, trying to build out an industry for the first time, but maybe in a way that's differently done than it's been done in the West, and try and invest both in research and in strategy, and trying to think through how to do that. And do it, it's an interesting question of, do you want to do it in open source? do it in ways that, in a sense, open the basis of trust by expressing the code in ways that make it much easier. I mean, if one is worried about this, and then I'll stop about the so-called embrace, you know, the real challenge in embrace between the U.S. and China is a little company called Huawei, which I wouldn't embrace. Well, for those of you who don't know, Huawei is the network infrastructure company that's something like Cisco, the American company. It's a major player. It's a dominant player. It has its origins in the Chinese army. Okay, so that in fact it is, and it's a very complicated issue about what are the security questions involved in an embrace in that kind of way. So doing something or beginning down a road that's quite different in terms of how the code is written and how the problems are addressed might ultimately open into ways in which one could enter into the market economies. But I agree with your point. Russia, in economic terms, has to view itself as Denmark. That is a small country that's more or less an economic taker and has to adjust to and develop its strategies rather than being able to reshape the economic field on which it fits.
Well, thanks very much for these comments. Let me start out with Mathilde's last comment on stakeholders. I'm very sympathetic to the idea of stakeholder. That is, it's the idea that it's not just shareholders, this idea that dominates the American finance literature, that the corporation, this is FAMA, you know, the corporation is owned by the shareholders and that's it. Nobody else has a stake in the game whatsoever. The community, the workers, the suppliers, the network of contractors, they're out of the game. There's only the shareholders. Well, there's some contestation of that idea, but let's think about this politically. I mean, how in the world would you introduce this idea? I believe that the only countries that have it institutionalized are countries that have worker participation or Mitbestimmung. The Germans have it because they have co-determination. They have worker participation on their boards. So let's think about politically, I mean, if that's what you mean, that is a kind of stakeholder model. How would you institutionalize a stakeholder model? We could talk about stakeholders, but what would that mean institutionally? The only way that stakeholders get voice in the political systems of most of the constitutional democracies is through their political system, but institutionalizing them through any kind of corporate governance reform, the only cases we really have of that are the German co-participation cases. Now, let me give you a historical comment about the origins of that. Where does that come from? I believe that that really comes, its origins are pension funds. The origin of that system really goes back to that nice left-wing radical revolutionary Otto von Bismarck. The pension funds of the Western world begins with Bismarck in the 1880s trying to contain radicalism, said let's have pension funds and medical care systems for the workers and they'll calm down. We'll prohibit we'll get rid of the Social Democratic Party, but we will allow pension funds. But if we're going to tax the workers and make them contribute to pension funds, it's their money, so they should participate in the boards that actually administer those pension funds. So that is the origin of the idea of co-participation, and that seems a very practical thing. So I would say that is a way of doing it. I always wondered when privatization occurred in Russia way back, that what interesting it might have been to have done something similar, that is to create pension funds that own these corporations and put participatory systems of many different voices on it. That would have created quite an interesting institutional difference. So that is an institutional, and in other words, what I'm trying to say is that one of the institutional ways of creating stakeholder that you're talking about is, in fact, to think about ways of vesting different voices on these different financial institutions. And so then my question to both of you is, both of you articulated, by you I'm pointing to the two Russian nationals in the group, both of you talked about what can you do to reassure investors to bring money into Russia. You both articulated a need for it. And I'd be curious what you say. What is it that you think you would have to do? What is it that investors would find reassuring? You mentioned the formal adaptation of a variety of corporate governance codes. And I wonder what you think of how significant that. Does that have any impact? Does an investor see that a corporation has actually done that? Do they find that reassuring? I've tried to study these codes, and I find that there's it's a little bit like, forgive me for saying this, it's a little bit like Trump. You can adopt a code, but it doesn't necessarily mean that anything real has actually happened. You could have a formal procedural adaptation of a code, but in fact, you don't really know what the firm is actually doing just because it has formally adopted it. So I'm curious to know, there are other kinds of things that have to happen. I would think before an external investor would know, would feel reassured that in fact the corporate governance of the firm has changed in ways that would be reassuring to that investor. And is it a matter of the firm? Is it also a matter of, again, is it formal legal system? Are we talking about legal reforms? Are we talking about political reforms?
Peter.
Are we talking, sorry, what am I doing? You're talking too long.
You're overtime, yes.
I'm overtime.
Sorry.
Okay, I'll stop. Does it also take political reforms of believing in a political system that actually will honor the legal contract of foreign money coming into a country? I'm curious what you all think of that.
Thank you, Peter. Let's use the rest of the time available to us for questions. I ask you, above all, to you can address any members of the panel, but give us questions and not manifestos. I ask you to begin by identifying yourself, and we'll begin over here. Yes, and there are microphones.
Hello, yeah, George de Macedo, great session. I actually want to leverage the Russia as Denmark point in the following way. So this is part of the cut your nose to spite your face, which you have mentioned. It's a variation from my country, Portugal, on what you said. Russia is a member of the G20. It was a member of the G7. It almost adhered to the OECD, as was just said. And yet, throughout this discussion, the leverage you can get for participating in the G20 or even chairing it, it's now Germany, but several countries that were not superpowers or not in the G7 ever, such as China or Turkey, have chaired it. So my question, especially to the two nationalists, is why is this such a distant theme? In the inaugural setting, we heard the Australian Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of Russia, they were at the origin of this. And now it seems to be irrelevant in Russia's challenge to respond. So it's a very simple question. Thank you.
Let's do questions one at a time. Would you like to respond, Yermolai?
Well, I mean, just a little bit on this link of this whole embrace topic, if I can actually also react to this.
Absolutely.
I would say, first of all, Russia needs to do a very different way, but a little bit what America did in the 19th century, which is focus on its own, on fixing things in Russia. So I think right now we are playing a game almost nostalgic for being, in the G20 and the Security Council. We've just got a lot of homework to do at home. And therefore, I think the number one priority should be, in terms of resources, attention, debate, discussions on doing the structural reforms Mikhail talked about, doing various sectoral reforms, doing political reforms, figuring out the right balance between center, regional, municipal, thinking about where local government fits into a country with 11 time zones that is more centralized than probably any country in the Eurasian, well, any in the Eurasian land space, but quite centralized, and that is, to me, the number one priority. And by the way, that whole embrace, to me, is not the embrace the governments that are, fighting with you. It's more as a value to say that to fix the domestic, you have to value the foreign, right? So it is not our strength is only through, again, integration per se, but just to believe that anything that is coming from abroad can only have upside. And it's hard because it has also risks, but that would be the behavior. And why not G20? Because I think that the fact is because the value like that is not there, and psychologically we're more playing realpolitik 19th century games. That would be my thought. I don't know if Mikhail has a different take on it.
No, I guess just very briefly, I don't think that Russia is not using the old institutions that it's part of. I think it's just that temporarily, possibly at this point of contemporary history, we're faced with some external difficulties, and therefore focusing attention on the BRICS and relationship with China. But I think it's not something that's viewed as a long-term removal from the international scene, and something that's not to Russia's advantage to abandon or not use international institutions Russia is already part of.
Now, let's see. I think you were second, yeah.
Yeah, hi, Art Franczyk, American Institute of Business and Economics. Kudrin's speech was mentioned. Productivity was mentioned with John's talk. In Kudrin's speech, one of my main takeaways was he emphasized productivity, the need for the increase in productivity to increase GDP. Okay, this was a big takeaway from his speech. What he didn't mention was, and we've talked about it here, is breaking down the Russian economy between the 70% state and the 30% private, and what the productivity rates are in absolute terms, let's say, versus the United States and Europe. You know, the latest numbers I've seen, these are not current, or maybe about 40%, something like that, but this is not current. The best study on this was McKinsey from 10 years ago. This was really the top study on the productivity in Russia. And my question is, does anybody have an idea of what those rates are, productivity rates, in absolute terms, from the public sector to the private sector, okay, and what kind of growth rates also that you're looking at, and what, just in a small list, needs to be done to improve the productivity in Russia. Okay, you know, he mentioned, one of the main things he mentioned was increasing the retirement age, okay, and continuous learning are a couple of things he talked about, but just to see your ideas. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion.
Just since you mentioned the McKinsey report, I think at the time, in 1998 was the first time we looked at it. At that time, it was 26% of the U.S. productivity rate. In 2009, it was around 30%. Depending how you measure it, which I think often is dollars per person, of course, devaluation has also kind of hit that. So I think it's probably closer to the 30. Look, one point on this, if you just multiply productivity by workforce, that's the traditional way. That's where Kudrin's whole pension fund thing comes in. On the other hand, if you listen to the topics about robots and automation and so on, you have the other problem, which is the new industry doesn't need nearly as many workers, so you even hope the current ones retire earlier. So that math's unclear which way it goes. It depends on the sector. The productivity areas where we really need to work, of course, ministries and so on, and Russia has like 2 million private security guards. I mean, those guys are not too productive GDP-wise. I mean, transportation sector and ЖКХ, the kind of basically utilities and buildings and services. Those are areas employing a lot of people, actually have a big chunk of GDP with very low productivity. Those you probably go first. And those industries, rail, 2 million. Man, that's less. It's 1 million actually. But the railway, sure. The problem is then you run into social issues. Okay, railway, 300,000. I know this topic. 300,000 of the million are working along the tracks in very remote places. So if you just say, "Sorry guys, we're no longer needed," what's the next step? Where do they go? How do you take care of it? So this is a very difficult part of the social space. Nonetheless, I would say, of course, in state it's less, and the privatization is probably a good vector.
Anybody else? John?
Just a quick observation. All fundamental economic transformations are social and political transformations. And the question is, how do you take care of those who are going to lose so they both aren't damaged and don't interfere with the processes of change?
Yeah, or they don't elect, a president from a completely outside the establishment, which makes the establishment freak out. And then nobody does.
That wouldn't have anything to do with our country. So
that's certainly the way it looks. Yeah.
No, I'm not.
Добрый день, Раевский Сергей.
Good afternoon, Alexei Raevsky from RANEPA.
My question to Mathilde, Minar. My question to you, Mathilde. Can you hear me? It doesn't work, does it? I have a brief one. You said in your presentation that we should be seeking new approaches to risk management and security. In the context of the subject matter of this discussion, challenges facing Russia, what new approaches would you suggest in managing security? Thank you.
Yeah, but I'm afraid I cannot answer your question because I don't know. It's not my expertise. So really, I can't answer your question. I'm sorry.
Anyone else? It was about particularly internet security.
The question is what, in the context of this, our session, what new approaches to managing security?
What do we mean by security? Literally, economic security,
risks in general,
digital, certainly digital. Yeah.
It's too general a topic to really take on.
Yeah.
Journal.
Our government ecological journal I represent from Moscow. You may not know, being in Moscow, that this year, 2017, in Russia, has been announced the Year of the Environment, protection of the environment. So my question is this. Yesterday, Brzezinski wrote an article, very in a Russian way. He said we have to think, the three of us, a cooperation between China, Russia, and the US. Yesterday, it was Old New Year. We marked the Old New Year. When we say between the three, we mean drinking between the three, whether it translates into English or not. So can we drink between the three, economic cooperation between Russia, China, and the US, in peaceful purposes, in the area of the environment? Is such cooperation possible? Like monitoring hurricanes, which is a big problem for America, and in particular from California. Can Caltech, California, the California Pension Fund, can they build a dirigible, a Zeppelin, in the air, a balloon in the air with motor to monitor and to predict the movement of hurricanes near the shore of the United States and other countries, or monitor smog in China? We have a number of problems there as well. This is the question. Is it possible to arrange global environmental cooperation? My personal viewpoint, it is not possible. Trump said, the way I understand him, there is no global ecology or environment. The environment is your table, your desk, or golf course, the grass in the golf course. Would you agree?
The first thing I'd say is that we have a new government that's drunken, given your metaphor of drinking on fossil fuel. So the question is what to do, but you're talking to the right people. California, we will see national initiatives continue, but they will be state-level initiatives in the United States, and they will be very powerfully launched, in particular out of California, in a whole array of domains. I mean, this isn't the place to open that conversation, but I think American national policy will be made at the state levels over the next 4 years, and it will be made heavily with leadership out of California. It's guaranteed. It's already, as it were, as law on the books.
I think there are many more things to be said and many more discussions we could have, but we are out of time. I'd like to thank all our panelists and discussants. I think it's been very stimulating. I would like to say, in particular, from a personal point of view, as someone who runs a global public policy program, that everyone has contributed something very significant, both of our speakers who bring expertise from outside the Russian context, my Russian colleagues, both of whom I might mention teach in our master's program. Mikhail teaches a lot, Yermolai a bit. But both of them have picked up on themes that they have already sounded. In Yermolai's case, the need for Russia to both at the same time get its own house in order, but also that given the imperatives of the global economy that John mentioned, the need to be an active and aware participant in that. And Mikhail also, whose work I greatly admire, and one of the reasons I'm so thrilled that Mikhail teaches in our program is that he's not just an academic, he's a practitioner. He is doing the work of reform, serious structural reform in Russia every day of his life. So he brings that to the classroom. And I think these are themes that are very important to all of us. Thank you for your patience, for your attendance, and good day.